as we're watching the deep state effectively get dismantled, one of the things that's been sort of a hot button for us is the idea that we need to remember that behind these institutions, which are being, just they're on their heels at the moment, are actual individuals. And I think this is a holdover for us as researchers because our entire job back in the early days was to delve in and find the individuals behind this and sort of ferret them out and what these different people were doing. And typically one individual would then lead to another individual, which would lead to another individual. And you just find this snowball effect of unraveling. But I guess the point that we're saying here is this idea that amidst all of this deconstruction of the deep state is to remember, have some caution of using sort of this blob term, that actually what we're up against is we are up against very real actors who are engaged, probably from their perspective, in almost a life or death struggle against what's going on. And it may be a good way it's one of the reasons that we focused so often on Norm Eisen and the lawfare crowd, is because these are real actors that have proven very adept at thwarting different policies, et cetera. They're the guys that were filing all the lawsuits with the judges. So it's not this faceless deep state. We can actually put a name to the deep state, to the various actors. And it's worth just kind of revisiting that and remembering throughout this process that we are up against very specific individuals in this ongoing battle.
Conversely, it's actually probably helped these people that the whole thing has been described. We started off with the military-industrial complex. That's kind of how this started, 60, 70 years ago as a term for what some people call blob, some people call deep state. What was added to this military-industrial complex over the years, of course, was the intelligence complex,
community.
or as they call it, community, which in and of itself is one of these, again, euphemistic terms. So, I would argue that this whole, whatever you call it, if you don't attach the human agency, if you make it this thing, this it, then it is euphemistic. Then you are already downsizing, downgrading, downplaying the problem. And as you already said, the problem is that there is human agency. All these bad things are not done by the system. All these bad things are done by individuals. Now, of course, the system follows. So, for instance, we had this whole US aid scandal where US aid was just doling out money left, right, and center. That's the system. The people who suck up that money, they follow. They'll just take the money. We talked about this group in North Carolina. It was just sucking up, I think it was like $1 billion for South Africa, supposedly, but then they paid themselves massive salaries and on and on and on. So I would say, yeah, those people are part of the system. They're part of this thing, this it. But the it's like an ant colony. They'll always follow in a certain way, or bee colony, or whatever you want to talk about. That's just kind of human nature. But at its core, the handing out the money, if we're just going to stick to the people, is human agency. Samantha Power, US aid. Or you mentioned Eisen, all the lawfare. Lisa Monaco, both lawfare, Russiagate, by the way, Eisen as well, Russiagate. We have so many names. When we talk about Ukraine, the Ukraine war, and all the grift that came from that, it's a giant gravy train, not just 2022 to now, but all the way back to 2014. Right. All the money that poured into that country. Well, again, you're talking about US aid, but you're also talking about Victoria Nuland. That's a person. That's a real human being. And she did horrendous things that set all this in motion. So
you're talking about George Kent. You're talking about Amos Hochstein. You're talking about, you could go on down the list. Like you say, we're talking about individuals.
Exactly.
One of the things that
agency. And
well, go ahead. Continue.
Is that whenever the deep state attacked me, yeah, that's a nice kind of, sounds flowery and nice and whatever. And it might even sound appealing and persuasive. But I think ultimately, unfortunately, it helps the people who actually do those things because they're almost protected. I mean, who outside of our kind of circles, our kind of corner, people who watch our show, people on Twitter, kind of in our extended corner, who knows who Amos Hochstein is? Seriously, who in the public knows who that guy is? I'd say even Norm Eisen, that probably just go and ask someone on the street. Most people don't know who that guy is.
Yeah, although he's coming to a lot more prevalence now, thank God. It the way I was looking at it, it's kind of a circular process from my vantage point. And like, let's go to Obama. What Obama did was he took some of these pre-existing systems and he took them over. And that ranges from USAID, it ranges from the DOJ, et cetera, and converts them. And then once they've been sort of grabbed and taken over and held captive, then the system begins to take over the individuals. So, it kind of starts off with certain individuals taking the system, but then the system captures individuals and it becomes a self-perpetuating thing. And that's how USAID kept growing and growing, and the graph gets bigger and bigger and bigger. It enables itself effectively. But, as we're talking about, these are individuals that make it up. There are individuals that are doing the actions. And, Norm Eisen is such a great example, in part because he wove his way through the entire time frame, going back to his time as ambassador in Czechoslovakia and everything that he was doing. He was an activist ambassador, literally acting out against the government of Czechoslovakia, enabling things like Gay Pride Week, et cetera, et cetera. There was a lot of kind of color revolution elements to that. And then, the guy continues on, and he wove his way throughout the entirety of the Obama administration, and then became kind of the undercurrent of the entire weaponization that was turned against Trump. And that's a specific name, a specific institution, Brookings Institution, crew, things, tangible things that we can point to that we're actually funding and enabling his activities throughout. And, that guy has interesting touch points with everybody, including Victoria Nuland, Robert Kagan, all of these, ex-Obama officials. His longtime partner, Michael Podhoser, who I still to this, the guy's known as the architect of the 2020 election. These are high-level Democrat operatives that are working behind the scenes with a habit of pushing forward kind of these more talking heads and let them take the heat while they continue to operate behind the scenes. And it's those people that have to be unearthed, pulled forth, and put before the public. And those are the guys that have to be held accountable. And that kind of comes back full circle. If you call an entity the blob, if you call it the intelligence community, and I do all the time, so it's not that, it's a good way to view things. But if you don't put a face to it, how do you have accountability? It's impossible. You have to put a face to things in order to have accountability, and there has to be accountability, or these things will happen again.
Which is why, as you already mentioned, Eisen has finally got a bit of a spotlight on him, mainly, by the way, thanks to Elon Musk, who's been tweeting about him. Because again, I don't think many people know who he is, and they still don't, but it's improving. People are starting to understand that. And by the way, we put out an article, a lengthy one, a very detailed one, going through all the stages of how this guy was groomed and built up by Obama, and then how he became sort of one of these chief operatives of the deep state, if we want to keep using that word. But it's an actual person with human agency who does a lot of horrific things. Starting with Russiagate and then the whole lawfare. This is another thing that is kind of overlooked when we look at the deep state. So some people might associate the lawfare against Trump. Like, let's start with the Mueller inquisition as sort of deep state-ish. And that's true, but there are individuals involved. And in this case, the ones that we've heard about, like Robert Mueller, people have heard about, or this absolutely horrendous, loathsome man called Andrew Weissman, who actually was running things. Okay, people have heard about him. But what people don't know is that the legal theories, like fake fraudulent theories, to advance all this, to advance the lawfare, they were written by people like Eisen, or organized
Weissman's
anyway.
nothing. Weissman's one of the useful idiots that put forth. Maybe he's somewhere in between he's maybe a little bit better than the regular useful, but he's not the guy that's actually doing anything. If you look at the history of Eisen, it really shines a little bit of a light into things, and I've got a couple of my own theories on him that I'm going to keep to myself for right now. But Eisen was a schoolmate in Harvard of Obama's, and not just like they were close friends. So going through Harvard, they were effectively politically growing up together. In 2003, Eisen founds Crew. And, Crew is Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington. That's the antithesis of Democrats putting a nice sounding name on an institution that is doing anything but. What Crew really was set up to do was effectively to attack Republicans for a lack of ethics while enabling the Democrat side, the progressive side, to continue on doing very unethical things. It was effectively a one-sided watchdog. That was its purpose. And then in 2008, Eisen goes to work for the Obama campaign and then ultimately becomes, goes to Czechoslovakia, etc. Then he comes back and he's Obama's ethics czar. Well, what's he doing in that position? The exact same thing that he was doing at Crew, where he established a code of ethics that were then rigidly applied to Republicans, and there was all kinds of loopholes that were exploited on the Democrat side. It was effectively, once again, a one-sided policing. And for whatever
it's so
reason,
interesting. You mentioned the sort of the ties these people have with other people. This is very important to remember. These are not so. First of all, there's human agency. This is so important. And secondly, the human agents are often tied in some way to each other, where this is sort of a network thing that grew over time. So, I mean, the other one is Strobe Talbot. I mean, that guy goes all the way back to Bill Clinton's time at Oxford. That's where they were they were roommates, and then he kept being kind of on board, but he was one of these operatives. Brookings. Then he's got his I think his brother-in-law, a guy called Cody Shearer, who then became the Clinton I don't know, like henchman, and I don't quite mean it that way, but operative anyway. Drafted the early dossier. That wasn't.
I was just going to say the guy who actually wrote the dossier. Yeah.
And so that guy ties in with Talbot. Talbot ties in with Clinton, and so you have these connections. But these are all real human beings. And again, I can't emphasize that part enough. This is not the system. This is not like an ant colony where everyone kind of just follows orders or follows sense, as in the case of ants.
Well, these are the people who built the system that enabled the ants. David Brock,
Exactly.
Another one, the guy who is probably the one that's setting the tenor. We all see how suddenly Democrats are talking in a single voice, right? They got the talking points. Well, it probably came from him. And so you see these people that are tied together and that have this long history and that came into political power together. Very smart people, unfortunately, but that's what engendered their success. And they constructed the systems. They took over the systems, or they built the systems, or both. And then those systems sort of hit a point where they almost became self-functioning. But real people did that.
Real people did that. And one of the greatest things about Doge and what Elon Musk is doing, which has not been, I think, talked about at all, I don't even think anyone's ever mentioned it, is that they're breaking apart the deep state, but again, not in terms of like the sort of ant colony thing, but in terms of the human agents, the actual people doing all the damage. Because what are they doing now? Biden's out of power, Democrats out of power, so they can't give them nice, can't make them the ambassador somewhere, or can't do all those things. So what they've done in the past, and hence Samantha Powers was in U.S. aid and people like that, that's where they would then draw their money. They would just, or they or their wives or whatever would be on some group, some board, some whatever, the democracy initiative, blah, 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 all this kind of rubbish. And it's all just a grift, but it's basically just, that's what pays these people, and it pays them very, very well. Well, now you've turned that off. Now you've got a real problem with in terms of these people, because these people, well, where are they going to get their $1.5 million, and we're talking in those kinds of ranges, salary from? Ooh, so you're drying them out, and this is so important. This is such an important part in all of this, specifically because it's not the deep state, it's individual people, and those people are now feeling it, because the money's going to dry up.
When you build a system requires energy. For these systems, money is the energy. It enables it to continue and it spreads out. We've talked about grant laundering, which is a process whereby, money can go in under one name and then it gets dispersed into sort of anonymous ways to all the different NGOs, nonprofits, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All of that is basically fuel into the system. And all of a sudden, that spigot is getting turned off and the gears start to grind and seize up. And that's sort of what's happening right now. And that's why they're in such a deep panic. Because the funding, I don't know about you, but I underappreciated the amount of funding that was coming right out of the government. Like, I knew that a lot of our tax dollars were being subverted, but the numbers that we're seeing are just so astronomical. And it's I think that's part of what has everybody so energized is this idea that, wait a minute, everything, we knew we had a system that was built against us. We didn't quite have our hands around it. It was kind of nebulous. We've been trying to figure it out. Now we can see it with greater clarity, but concurrently we find out that not only were we being ripped off, we were being ripped off to pay for the very thing that was built to work against us. And suddenly that's exposed.
I completely agree with you that the breadth and width of it and depth of it, I mean, all of it is surprising even to people like us who've been looking at this stuff for a long time. So look, I remember for years and years, we've been talking about US aid in terms of the Wuhan lab. Like, what on earth were they funding gain of function for over there? I mean, it's just beyond ridiculous.
$50 million since what, the early 2000s or maybe 96? A lot of money.
Right. We talked about Ukraine, all the money that was flowing there. And I'm not talking since 2022. I'm talking way, way earlier,
right?
Even before 2014. I mean, that's part of all this Newland funneled $5 billion with a B into there before the 2014 coup. I mean, that was part of what funded the coup. So we talked about that. We knew about that. Of course, we knew about the illegal immigration. We talked about this many times on the show, how this was funded by U.S. taxpayers. So, we talked about it. We knew about it. But I agree with you. The extent of it. For instance, I did not know that all these I knew about the Ukrainian newspapers being propped up. I didn't know about the US newspapers being propped up. I didn't know about this fake arrangement which they had where a newspaper would create a premium subscriber service, which no one would ever subscribe to because it's super expensive. Right. But it was just used as a smokescreen, as a vehicle to get governments. It's only designed so that government subscribes to it, and then you have a perfectly legal, even though totally unethical, horrendous arrangement where the government funnels. Was it 8 million a year to Politico or to various other, So I think that's been really eye-opening. And of course, as you say, it's not just a grift. When you look at, for instance, Eisen, right? So he was involved with everything. 2016, Russiagate, Ukrainegate, the fortifying the 2020 election. All of that,
the impeachment of
against
Trump.
us. So
January 6th.
What I'm trying to say is
every major event Eisen was a part of.
That's right. So if I could just sum it up here, it's lose-lose. First, there's like billions of taxpayer money gone, and second, it's also used against us. So it's not just a grift. If it was just a grift, it would probably be just not even half as bad, where someone just takes a lot of money and has a nice life. That's not good. But at least it's sort of neutral in the end, apart from the money. But here, it's so much worse. They take all the money, they have a nice life, and they work against you.
It's sort of like we were able to finally put a name and data to the things that we'd been feeling all along. It's a realization, I guess, almost on my part, in the sense that I feel like, well, I always kind of wondered how the Democrat Party was so strong. Like, the policies were all wrong. It was an emotionally driven entity, and sort of like, how do they maintain their power structure? It doesn't make sense. How is it self-sustaining? Well, now we have the answer to that. It was self-sustaining because of the siphoning off of all the money. And you take that away, and you're starting to watch the Democrat Party begin to crumble under its own weight. And it's really fascinating to watch. A perfect example of what's going on. And I can't wait to hear more news out of this. But Biden had his $27 billion greenhouse gas fund. Another nice sounding name. What it's looking like right now is that entire thing was designated to be basically a giant play toy, a piggy bank for Democrats. Stacey Abrams, how many billions she may have gotten out of that. We don't have all the details yet, but it looks pretty serious. I know Lee Zeldin's been making a lot of noise about that, and I think we're probably going to continue to get more revelation. So huge numbers that are being distributed to one side, one political party to basically sustain it and keep it going.
And then with Zeldin, just to the pushback has been that he's found these 20 billion gold bars that were hidden. And so I've seen some pushback from the usual suspects, like, well, there was no gold. No one hid any gold or whatever. Of course, the whole thing was metaphorical, but it is true that 20 billion were taken and parked in some bank accounts in order to be distributed to these groups and hopefully not found by him. And so that the next 4 years of Trump, they could just keep going on with their grift kind of on the side where no one would see what's going on. I mean, this kind of brings me to the whole financial arrangements. This is your wheelhouse. What on earth is going on with all these payments not being traceable because they're not entering any details on them?
When I saw that, my mind boggled. Now, I know there's some arguments over the computer language, and that is outside, running on COBOL, and why it wasn't changed. That is totally outside of my wheelhouse. But what I can't wrap my head around is the fact that they didn't have unique identifiers for the SSNs and that those weren't cleaned up, and that it wasn't properly audited. I have to say that, by the way, what alarms me more is the potential errors over the Treasury. That actually I find a lot more alarming. This is just outright fraud. If I do worry a little bit about what we may find over at Treasury and what effects that may have for the Treasury market, but that's a separate discussion. The fact that could be allowed to happen, and what probably shouldn't get escaped in this, is that everybody allowed this to happen. And what were they talking about? It was, I forget the figures, but I think it was 20 million Social Security numbers for over 100 and 15 million for 110 and over. So it's less probably about Social Security payments being made directly to those numbers and more about having a whole availability of millions of Social Security numbers that could be used for the illegal flow that was concurrently coming into our country, whether it was for benefits, whether it was for voting, whatever, that all of that could be enabled through that process. So, but we can't lose sight of the fact that this was allowed to happen, and it wasn't just Democrats. Republicans allowed this to happen too. Nobody did anything. Some of these things were flagged. The Social Security thing, I think, was actually flagged at one point, at least in part by the IG, came up with and noted some problems. Nobody did anything about it. It just allowed it to continue. And maybe that's apathy. I guess I think it's probably more than that, is you don't want to upset a system that's working for you. So there's blame on, you got to blame Republicans too.
100%. I mean, at least 40%. I'm minded to say 50%. I mean, they were all in on it. But again, coming back to this,
I don't know. I feel like the Democrats were much more directly involved in terms of using the flow to oil their machine, and Republicans were maybe using that flow to oil their, kind of the defense side of business, et cetera. It seems like the corruption was maybe more overt on the Democrat side, but the GOP certainly enabled it, and they had their own benefits that they were receiving from doing that. They just didn't seem to transfer it into a party power structure.
Yeah, no, I mean, probably, but I'd really like to look at the numbers. I'm sure there's a lot of Republicans whose, spouses had these $1.5 million jobs and on and on and on, that kind of stuff. But, coming back to this whole idea of the human agency in this, there was one interesting example here a few days ago that Elon Musk, I think, reported about. Do you remember that? Where there was, I think it was an IRS, where it was someone who came forward and talked to the Doge people to tell them where the bodies are buried.
Oh yeah, I don't
And
think
then
that
that
was. I
guy
think
was
that was the
fired.
Social Security Administration. It was a senior
Oh, it was there.
official
Okay.
in the Social Security Administration who came forward to verify, and that finally came out right at the time that there was a lot of attack from the left that, oh, that's just nonsense and you don't understand how the system works. And, they knew about that and no money was going out. And then concurrently with that, you have a high ranking official within the Social Security Administration, which it comes out that no, they actually went to Doge and say, hey, the system's been completely, it's fraud, it's being manipulated, here's the problem, and pointed them right to that. Yeah, a lot of people don't realize that that's actually how Doge found out about that. It was a high-level whistleblower that grabbed their hand and took them over and showed it to them.
Yeah, that's right. So this guy was then fired by his supervisor for spilling the beans. And then, of course, this fed through to, I guess, Elon or whoever was in charge of that particular team. And then the supervisor was fired. This guy, I think his name was Leland, was reinstated, and he was made the supervisor. It's sort of a nice story, but it's also a cautionary tale, both in terms of the people you're still dealing with, and there are so many, like the fired supervisor, who don't have the country's best interests at heart. They just want to maintain their gravy train. They want to maintain their nice life. They want to maintain the system. And these are all human actors. And that's why I'm saying all this. You got the people like this guy Leland, who's also a human actor, and he did a good thing, even though he's in the system. So that's another thing we haven't really talked about so much, that, when we talk about the blob, the deep state or whatever, there are actually some good people in there, like this guy. So it's about finding them and elevating them and getting rid of the other ones. And that it's going to be extremely tedious and difficult, and it's going to take a long time. It won't be clean. It won't be finished in 2 years or 4 years. There will be a lot of leftovers and so on. But the start has obviously been made. And I hope they find more of these people who know where the bodies are buried. And by they, I mean the Doge teams going into these various agencies. I don't know how they identify them. Do they?
They're going to find them, because these are people that have been wanting to speak out for, however long, and it's political suicide to do so. I just have to think more of these are going to be coming forth. One other quick story, we're talking about names, and something just jumped to mind. And I think both of us, I know I sent something, I think you did as well, about, the Russiagate, what do we want to see? And one of the things I said I wanted to see was a Michael Atkinson transcript. And Michael Atkinson was the Inspector General for the intelligence community. And in terms of, talk about putting a name to an event, the rules that he changed to basically allow Eric Ciamarella and Vindman to come forth and act as these whistleblowers for Trump's impeachment, it kind of came down to Michael Atkinson. And that enabled the whole Trump impeachment. So ultimately, the ability for the Trump impeachment to really take off came back to Michael Atkinson and his actions that enabled that. That's a person. That's not, it's indicative of the corruption and fraud that's there, but it's actually also a specific person.
That is such a good example. One guy, if it had been a different guy, if that had been a different Inspector General, an honest one, not that there are many of them, but honest people exist. They just have to be placed in those positions.
Yeah, we have a pretty jaded view of all the IGs.
And I think that's now going to happen, that you're going to have these positions filled with honest people. But your point is so well taken. It just needed one honest guy, and that hurdle would have been too difficult to clear for Schiff and Vindman and Ciaramella and all these people in order to get the impeachment thing going. Now, I'm not saying they wouldn't have found something else to try and impeach Trump over, or would have created a new hoax or whatever. That's what they do. But that one would have come to a grinding halt, because there was just no way you could advance this through the intelligence community Inspector General just under the prevailing rules, which is what Atkinson completely set aside, changed the form, changed the rule, just completely ignored everything. So you're absolutely right. One guy caused so much damage, or at least allowed all the damage to happen.
You had the right guy at a critical bottleneck in the process who was willing to work with the rest of the people that were trying to go after Trump. Yeah, I mean, that could have hamstrung everything. They probably would have found another angle, but nevertheless, that's a great example of putting a name and a face to a larger event.